Morning. Memorial Day weekend, a great weekend to talk about democracy. Democracy will not come today, this year, nor ever through compromise and fear. I have as much right as the other fellow has to stand on my 2 feet and own the land. I tire so of hearing people say, let things take their course. Tomorrow's another day. I do not need freedom when I'm dead. I cannot live on tomorrow's bread. Freedom is a strong seed planted in a great need. I live here too. I want freedom just as you.
Good morning, and welcome to Universalist Unitarian Church of Farmington. My name is John Benarwitz, and I'm part of the Building and Grounds Committee. Our Reverend Leonetta is out of the pulpit today, and today's guest speaker is Karen Anway. I'd like to extend a special welcome to any visitors today. Please join us in the lower level after service for coffee hour. There's a welcome table for new members if you're interested in more information. And at this time, if you are a new member, I'd invite any new first-time visitors to stand. Let us know where you're from, a little bit about yourself. If not, we'd like to meet you. Yeah. Oh,
I didn't introduce myself.
oh, that's
My
fine.
name is Joni Carpenter. It's my second visit. I live in Farmington. I'm looking for and friendships. I wasn't prepared for this. But I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Well, nice to meet you, Joni. Thank you. During the service, we have supervised nursery for babies and toddlers. I don't see any in the crowd. FYI. Should you need to leave the service for any reason, there are 2 other locations in the building where the service is broadcast. An usher can direct you to those locations. Our UU principles begin with our pledge to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of all people. As we are a welcoming congregation, we welcome into our community people of all races, sexual orientations, belief systems, and ages, including any of the kids who are fidgety and create youthful noises. These little humans represent our future, and we welcome them fully in our meeting house. We have a couple of announcements, both of them by Diana.
Is it my turn?
Yeah.
Okay. You may have noticed my harpsichord.
It's a harpsichord.
There's a concert this afternoon. It's a fundraiser for UUCF, and it's at 3 o'clock, and you're all invited. And I have a request after the service. The sound of the harpsichord is for such a big instrument, it's kind of small. I would like some able-bodied people to help me lift it up the steps after the service. So please come up if you feel so inclined.
The more the merrier. And now our next hymn is hymn number 188, and Diana reminds me it's a really short one, so we'll sing it 3 times. As I usually do, I find myself channeling Leonetta and starting to sway. Those of you who know Leonetta, every song is a swaying song. And so please join me in reciting our litany today. From the busyness of every day, we gather once a week to remember who we are, to dream of who we might become. We travel this road together. We share this journey across differences of belief and opinion because we value diversity and because we care for one another. We travel this road together. As we gather in beloved community, let us open the holy havens of our hearts. Let us share the sacred places of our souls. For we are pilgrims who share a common path. We travel this road together. A perfect heart is one that has known love and loss, joy and sorrow. The perfect heart is one that has been shared. I invite you, if you have a joy or sorrow, to come up and share with us if you do.
I'm Bud, and I have my daughter Beth with me. She went through the RE here at church, and she's up here from Tennessee, and she came up because I had a cataract removed from my eye. Everything was supposed to be just wonderful, but for 2 days I was pretty much blind. I couldn't see anything and scared the heck out of me. And a duct was plugged up, so the pressure built up behind it, and we're relieving the duct so I can see. Actually, I can drive now. That was last week. And she was going to go home on Saturday, but her car wouldn't start, so we towed it into a shop, and we found that a 14-year-old car, the numbers on the parts are not necessarily the same as the part. So consequently, she's here until maybe Tuesday. We don't know if they can find parts for the car that fit. She may go back Tuesday. Anyway, I'm so glad to have her here. She's quite a comfort.
We give generously to support this church where love, justice, and equality inspire our acts of service and compassion. We dedicate these gifts to all that we stand for within the Unitarian Universalist tradition. Thank you, Diana Sebastian Bach. Show of hands, who wants the harpsichord every week? That's just me, just me? Okay, 3 or 4 of us. I thought that pretty cool. I don't know that Reverend Leonette will approve of the clutter, but I liked having it. Now I'd like to, for the next couple of things, the reading and then the sermon, I'd like to just introduce our guest speaker for the week. Her name is Karen Anway, and she is a regularly attending member from the Universalist congregation in Flint. And she will be delivering our messages today. So welcome, Karen.
Thank you. Diana, that was beautiful. Really beautiful. Thank you for that. And thanks for having me here today. So happy Memorial Day weekend. A few topics on democracy today. I'm going to start my reading today, which includes excerpts from the book God's Politics. I'm going to hold it up for you if you've not heard of this book. Pretty interesting read by Jim Wallis. He's the founder of Sojourners. Sojourners is dedicated to replacing religion in American public space and politics. So he describes a new vision for faith and politics in America's public space today. And so some selected readings from this book. Why can't we talk about politics and religion? These are 2 topics you are not supposed to talk about in polite company. Don't break up the dinner party by bringing up either of these subjects. That's the conventional wisdom. Why? Perhaps these topics are too important, too potentially divisive, or raise the issues of core values and ultimate concerns that make us uncomfortable. Yet, I hear and feel the hunger for a fuller, deeper, and richer conversation about religion in public life, about faith and politics. It's a discussion we don't always hear in America today. Sometimes the most strident and narrow voices are the loudest, while more progressive, prophetic, and healing faith gets missed. Abraham Lincoln had it right. Our task should not be to invoke religion and the name of God by claiming God's blessing and endorsement for all our national politics and practices, saying in effect that God is on our side. Rather, Lincoln said, we should pray and worry earnestly whether we are on God's side. Those are the 2 ways that religion has been brought into public life in American history. The first way, God on our side, leads inevitably to triumphalism, self-righteousness, bad theology, and often dangerous foreign politics. The second way, asking if we are on God's side, leads to much healthier things, namely penitence and repentance, humility, reflections, and even accountability. We need much more of all of these, because these are often the missing values of politics. Of course, Martin Luther King Jr. did it best with his Bible in one hand and the Constitution in the other. King persuaded, not just pronounced. He reminded us all of God's purpose for justice, for peace, and the beloved community, where those always left out and behind got a front row seat. And he did it bringing religion into public life in a way that was always welcoming, inclusive, and inviting to all who cared about moral values, spiritual or religious. Nobody felt left out of the conversation. Of course, God is not partisan. God is not a Republican or a Democrat. When either party tries to politicize God or co-opt religious communities for their political agendas, they make a terrible mistake. The best contribution of religion is precisely not to be ideologically predictable or loyally partisan. Both parties and the nation must let the prophetic voice of religion be heard. Faith must be free to challenge both right and left from a consistent moral ground. In many elections, the quote-unquote moral values voter becomes the defining story of the election. The conventional wisdom claims that Republicans do and Democrats don't get it. That the moral values responders simply meant voters against abortion and gay marriage, and that religious conservatives won the election. I welcome the discussion of moral values, and I believe the values debate should be the future of American politics. Of course, the questions are, which values and whose values? How narrowly or widely will values be defined? And how partisan will the discussion be? Will moral values debate cut both ways in politics, challenging both the political left and the political right? Will values be used as wedges to further divide us, or as bridges to bring us together? To find common ground by moving to a higher ground? We must now ask two questions. Where is the real debate in the moral values conversation? Because there are real differences in America on the values issues. And where can we find the common ground? Because there is also much that we share in common, which can be built upon. In a deeply polarized country, when half the people do feel crushed, the need for some kind of political healing and reconciliation becomes clear. And that could be one of the most important roles for the religious community. But that shouldn't mean compromise of deeply held values on either side. Instead, building on our most deeply held values may be the best way to move forward and create new political opportunities. In the spirit of America's greatest religious leader, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., the religious community could help a divided nation find common ground by moving to a higher ground. Very beautiful. Thank you, Diana. Can everybody hear me okay? I think I maybe didn't have the mic close enough to me earlier. Okay, good. You don't want to miss this one. I want to say that last year I was so fortunate to be able to attend Reverend Greg Ward's sermon where he won UU's 2018 Social Witness Sermon Contest. Reverend Ward is from Santa Monica UU Church. Here's Reverend Ward right here. He's from the Santa Monica UU Church. We talked after his sermon, and he gave me permission to share his sermon with my fellow Michigan congregants. So as I deliver this sermon, remember that these are his words, and his church that he refers to in the sermon is his congregation in Santa Monica, and also from the book I spoke about earlier. So. All right. In the Cigna Healthcare Network, my dad was number 9711420. I had to learn my dad's number. In the last few years of his life, my dad developed skin cancer. During his 3-year battle, I got to see a great deal of my dad's character, his tenacity and courage, his love, his sense of humor, and his sense of humaneness. I also discovered a lot about the character of his healthcare provider. They weren't too interested in my father's tenacity or courage, just his number, and whether that number fit into the box provided. Over 3 years, I spent many hours on hold to Cigna Healthcare representatives, trying to figure out how he could fit into the boxes provided. I came to wonder how his healthcare problems got so big and the boxes so small. Those hours led me to think and to research. One of the things I learned during that time was that the insurance industry hired more than 350 ex-congressional staffers to be high-priced lobbyists. Competitive firms organized together and spent more than $1.5 million per day to influence elected officials. Their goal was to minimize healthcare reform. When they finally answered my calls, the first thing Cigna wanted to know was my father's number. But I had discovered a bunch of numbers they didn't seem so interested in, like 39 million, as in the number of Americans who still don't have a number because they don't have health insurance. These are the people who not only have nothing to put in the box, they don't even have a box. 4 trillion, as in the amount of money the United States spends each year on health care. By comparison, the entire federal budget is only 3.8 trillion. This amount is by far the most of any industrialized nation, 52% more per person than the next most expensive national health care system, Norway. The Commonwealth Fund ranked the U.S. the worst performing of the top 11 developed nations in the world. 16, as in the percentage of my father's income, which he spends on health care each month, which qualifies him for inclusion in the growing category of the nation's underinsured. This category has grown over 67% to 28 million people in just the last 10 years. 62, as in the percentage of personal bankruptcies that are due to medical expenses. If none of these numbers so far has felt personally relevant to you, how about these? 131, as in the percentage that employer healthcare costs increased between 2000 and 2010. Or 21, the percentage increase in premiums for employees here in the last 3 years. And the numbers that stood out personally relevant to me about my dad's healthcare insurance company, 2.1 billion, as in the amount of profit Cigna Healthcare made the year my father was diagnosed. 120 million, as in the amount of money Cigna CEO Ed Anway was paid in the 5 years leading up to his diagnosis. These numbers can get a little lofty, so let me bring them down to earth in this story. In 2008, when Ed Anway was CEO, the company that employed Stacy Ritter's husband switched to Cigna Health. Stacy and her husband were caring for their twin 11-year-old daughters, who, in 2004, were both diagnosed with leukemia. They needed stem cell treatments. They survived the leukemia, but the glands that controlled their growth were damaged beyond repair from the treatment. To continue growing, they required growth hormone injections once a month. When Stacy's husband's company switched to Cigna, they refused to cover the injections. Each month, when Stacy took her daughters in for their injections, she was required to pay $440 out of pocket. Between the cancer treatments and the denied care, Stacy's family had to declare bankruptcy. During that same time, Ed Anway, then CEO of Cigna, made $12.7 million a year, which was roughly $5,883 per hour. Each hour, he made enough to cover a year's worth of the twins' treatments. Stacy and her family lost their house. In an article in The Nation, she said she planned to pack up and head over to Ed Anway's $7 million home, one of 4 he owned, and see if he would put them up for a little while. Just until they could get back on their feet. But my guess is she didn't fit into that box either. Now, if this isn't all disturbing enough, here's the saddest part. This sermon is not about healthcare. It's not about healthcare because healthcare is only one of a dozen different industries about which I could have made my point. I could have made the same case against the oil industry. I could have told the same stories about the banking industry or uncovered the same largesse about the auto, energy, or agricultural industries. The gun industry is similarly negligent in its loss of life ratio, as is the prison industrial complex. This sermon is really about the brokenness of a system that we are part of. And there is the great tragedy, because we don't seem to be cognizant of where we are in the brokenness all around us. And yet, our understanding of the role we play will help determine whether millions of people enjoy a healthy democracy or suffer from capitalistic exploitation. Let me explain. From the earliest days of community, people began to see an obvious advantage in joining together in cooperative endeavor for a greater shared enterprise. They discovered that well-organized networks and efficient division of tasks could outproduce individual effort in providing training, balancing systems, listening carefully to voices from the margins, could lead not only to more resources, better decision-making, and greater opportunity, but also shared advantage. From this, politics was born. Politics, a word that derives from Greek and Latin influences related to the word polite. and referencing affairs of state was merely the name for how things got done. As communities grew and systems became more complex, politics grew into conversations about power, how decisions are made, policy established, trade regulated, how revenue is summoned, and resources are distributed, all to serve individual and shared purpose. But power, people quickly discovered, is an intoxicating influence which alters the perspective of the owner. History shows how power impairs judgment, especially moral judgment. The idea of shared power and collective resources becomes skewed toward gaining and justifying advantage. Herein lies one of the stark tensions built into all political systems of government, especially democratic capitalism. Does the system favor labor, the workforce that carries out the work? Or does it favor the design, ownership, and capital that provides the possibility behind each idea? Sustainable systems, seeing the cooperative value of both, need balance. When the United States was formed, it was after a rebellious generations of enterprising peoples grew tired of toiling in vain under the dominant authority of a monarchy. The framers of our Constitution had in mind a more perfect union, where people's rights would be indivisible. No one would be reduced to less than their inherent worth. But from the very beginning, the U.S. Constitution was written with a moral compromise, known as the 3/5 compromise, as a cornerstone. People of color were counted as 3/5 of a person in the population census. This was the deal people in power brokered to determine how much federal money each state would receive and how many votes it would have in Congress. Not only were actual people reduced to a number, they were reduced to a fraction of a number, all for the sake of profit. Today, politics has evolved, but not always in a healthy way. The ideal of a country organizing for the corporate well-being of citizenry has been skewed towards citizens being organized for the well-being of corporations. Elected officials are in the pocket of corporate lobbyists who use media to control public opinion. Or, to use the words of P.J. O'Rourke, when buying and selling are controlled by legislators, the first things to be bought and sold are legislators. How did it get this way, you wonder? Let's talk about religion. Religion, also from the Latin, religar, means to take what is broken and make it whole. Like politics, it has also been an effort to establish order and meaning. It has been interested in decision-making, setting policy, regulating exchange. But where politics is interested in profitability, religion is interested in profitability. In other words, process, or the capacity to honor relationships, maintain fairness, and act from a place of love. From the earliest of days, the stories in primary religious texts have been stories about sending forth prophets of faith infused with commandments of love and justice to speak to kings about the lives of common people. Just like today, these prophets were not given seats at the tables of power. Their moral authority was not recognized in the place of fiscal authority. They showed up feeling called to speak truth to power. Now religion, it's true, has had to contend with its own internal corruption. Religion has been lulled by its own intoxicants of power, feeling a lure toward individual salvation. over its mandate to establish the beloved community, focusing on a few as elect and chosen, rather than all creatures being indivisibly and irreducibly part of the benevolent kingdom. And worst of all, religion has settled for passive politeness instead of being stinking mad at the corrupt affairs which are governing the kingdom. Religion, over time, has successfully been bent toward overlooking the corruption within world's affairs. Religion has adjusted. But as Indian spiritual advisor Jiddu Krishnamurti once said, it is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. Jim Wallace, the founder of Sojourners, a foundation dedicated to religion returning to its necessary place in the conversations of power, wrote the book from which I took today's sermon. He concedes that there is just as much bad religion as there is bad politics in this country. But the best response to bad religion, he contends, is not secularism, but in fact, better religion. Because if you want better politics, you won't get there without better religion standing up and demanding accountability. A few weeks ago, about 50 people stayed after service to explore the history of this church. It was interesting to watch so many people come alive when they heard or relived the stories of how this church stood up to McCarthyism in the 50s on issues like the loyalty oath, and to discrimination in the 60s against people of color during civil rights, and to the oppression of women and farm workers in the 70s. Interestingly, we ended that conversation talking about the generational gap between members who were there at that time and those who are coming through the door today. But I will tell you that even though the next generation looks different, acts different, talks different, and seems to have been born internally wired with electronic communications coursing through their veins, they want the very same things you wanted back then: love and justice for the world and their children. The causes they see, Occupy movement, climate change, Black Lives Matter, #MeToo, are simply the same causes with new names. They are simply the call for religion to speak truth to power. They, like you, simply want a faith not afraid to take a seat at the tables of corporate and political power. What's called for in the religion of tomorrow, like the religion of the last 50 years, is not an emphasis on piety or personal salvation. What's needed is for religion to awaken the moral conscience and courage these times demand, and push politics, not so that it veers to the right or left, but push it so it goes deeper. What's needed is to dive down and uncover the root of greed and corruption that is responsible for the growing poverty, hunger, and oppression of its people. What is needed is for religion to wake up and announce, we will no longer allow ourselves to be pitted against one another. We will unite and focus our efforts with pinpoint accuracy on the political corporatocracy that is slowly draining the democracy from our political system. Good religion needs to stop dividing itself into the saved and the damned and start demanding restoration for moral integrity upon which our country was founded. Stop allowing religion to be distracted by individual salvation and insist, like Reverend Dr. James Ford, that from now on, anybody who wants to get into heaven will need a letter of recommendation from the poor. So you want to know what I'm getting to? What I really want? I'll tell you my dream for religion, for not only our denomination and this church, but for our legislators who distribute power. I dream a day will come when every time the city council sits down to pass an ordinance, every time a county judge makes a landmark ruling on a social issue, every time state representatives consider a bill, and every time President Trump and Congress get ready to pass a law, they will stop, and they will clear the obvious lump in their throats and wipe beads of sweat from their foreheads, and with a tinge of fear for the moral consequences of what they're about to do, they will ask themselves, I wonder what the Unitarians would think of this. But even more than that, you know what I wish for? I wish for the day I can say this and it isn't heard as funny. Because as long as this is funny to us, it means we're not taking it or ourselves very seriously. What we need to know is that there are people in the world today, people with an inherent worth and dignity, who are being reduced to numbers, and even below that, to fractions. People are becoming statistics to a bottom line that was more about profit than prophecy, and our laughter brings tears to their eyes. One of those people was my father. My father, maybe like some of you, eventually gave up hope for himself, but not for his children or his grandchildren. And it killed him to think of leaving them in such a world. I'd give anything to be wrong. I'd give anything for trends to reverse and a religion like ours to rise up and speak truth to power. I'd give anything to see this broken system be magically restored to wholeness. But mostly, I'd give anything to talk to my dad one more time. Just to tell him we found a way to bring about love and justice. I promised him we would. If you find that way, I invite you to call him. His number is 9711420.
Now we turn to hymn number 170.
Okay, so kind of couldn't just leave it at that, right? In closing, I wanted to introduce you to this book, Daring Democracy. Now, some of you may have read or heard of this book because it was a UU 2018 common read. The book was written by Frances Moore Lappé, and some of you may know that name because she was the author of Diet for a Small Planet, which was a bestseller. She collaborated with Adam Eichron, who's a democracy fellow with Democracy Movement. Interestingly, Adam and Frances are 40 years apart, and they collaborated on this book. I got a chance to meet Adam. He's very energetic and young, gave me hope for the future, but so does this book. So if you're finding it tough to feel optimistic about the future of our democracy, then you need to read this book. The authors make it clear that building a positive, even joyful, pro-democracy movement that restores power to ordinary Americans isn't just possible, it's already happening. And despite all the bad news in this historic struggle, we have a lot going on for us. I invite you to read this book and learn not only how a genuine democracy is possible, but how there's a rewarding role for each of us in making democracy real. And he gives a lot of good ideas here. So final closing, I'm going to do a reading number 561 from Singing the Living Tradition book by Margaret Mead. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever does.
first, so you can just lift it straight up the steps. I don't know if this moves it.
The podium does move.
Should I move it some more? I'm not so good at this. Oh, yeah, that's what we need, someone, oops. There was some stuff back here, is that okay? Are we good? Oh my gosh, that looks so easy when you guys do it. Oh my gosh, thank you so much.
Don't Maggie.
I work out.
Oh, you Next time we give you the heavy end.
It's good for everyone.
Sorry.
Like this way? Yeah. Not, yeah. Well, just move it back. Move it that end back. And, yeah. Oh, move not that way. I was just thinking. You know what? That's probably not good. We have my sister sitting in the bench, and then I was thinking, you know, if it was just a harpsichord solo, this would be perfect. But we have an oboe player and a bassoon player. I think we're probably gonna come back this way and maybe straighten it a little. I'm sorry. Back. It's gotta be back, or somebody's gonna fall off here. Yeah, that's pretty good. And we can, no, that's not good. Yeah, you need to angle it a little. Angle it a little, yeah. That's good. Let's try that, and if, we can always fuss with it if we need to. Probably that end probably.
I'm playing oboe right here.
Oh, well, yeah, if we can get this out of the way, it's probably okay, right? Make sure we don't hit the seat there. That's not a cheap seat. It did? It might be more durable than rubber now, I think it's broken.
Good.
You guys are marvelous.
Put them on casters.
There you go. Now you have
Awesome.
Where's this?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's good. Yesterday we were playing kind of like this, because we had the harpsichord down here, and we were, and then the bassoon player didn't have room for his instrument.
So you got enough room here?
Yeah, oh yeah, I think this is gonna be really good. Thank you.
So now my question for you. How did you get this to stretch? This doesn't fit in a Jetta or whatever.
It fits in the cargo van normally, I have to rent one. But we had a concert once at a church downtown, and she came with a Ford Flex. I went, oh no, it's not. But it did.
Ford Flexes are weirdly
Those
spacious
are
inside.
amazingly weird.
So Bev has one. Bev Church.
Oh! You got this into a Ford Flex? So,
Do you take the
I
legs
mean-
off them?
yeah.
Oh yeah.
So
Okay.
this
So
comes
this
off,
sits
right?
on a platform.
Okay.
This goes in the bag. These legs on screw.
Okay, all right.
And then that moving dolly, you set it on its side and you roll it. And fortunately for us with our handicap accessorized stuff, there are no nasty stairs to go on. You just roll it in. Once you lift it out of the.
So I could totally get a harpsichord. So easy.
How? Oh.